Hello everyone, this is Pratima and welcome back to Planet Physiology. In the previous video, we have seen that hypothalamic nuclei are grouped into preoptic, supraoptic, tuberal and mammillary areas, and they show extensive connections with different regions of the brain. Today we shall discuss functions of hypothalamus. For the sake of understanding or remembering, we can group the various functions of hypothalamus under four headings as autonomic functions, where hypothalamus regulates autonomic nervous system, which in turn regulates the systems like cardiovascular, gastrointestinal system and also the pupil size. Next category is endocrine functions, which includes regulation of anterior and posterior pituitary gland activity by the hypothalamus. Then regulation of behavioral functions like regulation of food and water intake, regulation of body temperature, sleep-wakefulness cycle, regulation of reproductive functions and role in emotions. And the last one is role of hypothalamus in circadian rhythm. So let's study details of each function starting with autonomic functions. Hypothalamus is considered as head ganglion of autonomic nervous system. Anterior hypothalamus and preoptic area control the activity of parasympathetic system and thereby decrease heart rate, blood pressure and cause cutaneous vasodilation. They also stimulate gastrointestinal secretions and motility and cause pupillary constriction. In contrast, posterior and lateral hypothalamus regulate activity of sympathetic system and hence stimulation of these regions increase heart rate and blood pressure. They also cause cutaneous vasoconstriction, decrease gastrointestinal activity and pupillary dilation. Note that for visual memory, the text boxes are color coded with the hypothalamic nucleus or the area concerned as shown in the diagram. Here is the first memory cue for nuclear regulating autonomic activity, AP and not PP. That is, anterior nucleus regulates parasympathetic activity and not the posterior nucleus. Hence, the posterior nucleus is concerned with sympathetic regulation. Okay, now coming to the endocrine functions of hypothalamus. First is regulation of anterior pituitary secretions. As we have seen in connections, tuberal area and especially the arcuate nucleus secretes various hypothalamic releasing and inhibitory hormones like growth hormone releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, etc. They are secreted in median eminence and from here these hormones are transported to the anterior pituitary by the portal vessels and then regulate its secretion. Second endocrine function is synthesis and release of posterior pituitary hormones. Supraoptic and paraventricular nucleus synthesize the hormones ADH, that is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Nerve fibers arising from these nuclei form hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, which terminate in posterior pituitary. Hence, the hormones synthesized by these nuclei are released from posterior pituitary. Now coming to the behavioral functions. The first is regulation of food intake. Food intake or eating behavior depends on various factors like neural, hormonal, metabolic, environmental, social and genetic factors. Nutritional state, status of energy expenditure, emotional state of an individual also affect food intake. Hypothalamus plays central role in integrating all these factors. So let's start with the neural factors. Hypothalamus has regulatory centers which control food intake. It has feeding center which is located in lateral hypothalamus. Stimulation of feeding center gives sensation of hunger and hence it is also called as hunger center. Feeding center is intrinsically active. That means it is always active. And a lesion in feeding center leads to anorexia. That is, despite of availability of food, animal does not eat. feeding center is inhibited by another center in hypothalamus called satiety center. Stimulation of satiety center gives sensation of satiety and hence the name. Satiety center is located in ventromedial nucleus of hypothalamus. Cells in the satiety center act as glucoreceptors and these are insulin dependent. Normally, glucose influx in the neural tissue does not require insulin, but glucose entry in hypothalamic glucoreceptors depends on insulin. So, glucose entry activates satiety center, which in turn inhibits feeding center. Hence, any lesion in ventromedial hypothalamus leads to hyperphagia and hypothalamic obesity. This regulation of food intake by hypothalamic centers is known as glucostatic hypothesis. Here is the memory cue to remember the hypothalamic nuclei concerned with food intake. Visualize a car representing hypothalamic nuclei involved in regulation of food intake. Just as fuel is added through the lateral filler neck, the lateral nucleus serves as feeding center. The fuel tank is situated on the medial aspect of the car. When the tank reaches capacity, signaling fullness, it refuses more fuel, akin to the ventromedial nucleus acting as satiety center. Now let's study interaction between these two centers with the help of flowchart. Food intake increases blood glucose level. This causes release of insulin. In presence of insulin, glucose enters the glucoreceptors and activates satiety center. Now, the satiety center sends signals to feeding center in the lateral hypothalamus and inhibits it. As a result, person or the animal stops eating. After several hours of this, as blood glucose returns to the resting level, insulin secretion is stopped. Now, as there is lack of insulin secretion, glucose cannot enter the glucoreceptors and thus satiety center is inactivated. This removes its inhibition over feeding center and person feels hungry and begins to eat. Glucostatic hypothesis also explains polyphagia in diabetes mellitus. Now these two hypothalamic centers are also influenced by other factors. So let's have a quick look at the hormones influencing hypothalamic centers. Arcuate nucleus of hypothalamus is a key integrative center for various metabolic signals and hormonal inputs related to energy balance. It has orexigenic and anorexigenic neurons. Orexigenic neurons primarily produce and release neuropeptides like neuropeptide Y and agouti-related peptide, which is abbreviated as AGRP. They stimulate appetite and increase food intake. Neuropeptide Y acts through Y1 to Y5 receptors within the hypothalamus and other brain regions to increase food intake, whereas AGRP inhibits melanocortin receptors and hence promote the feeding behavior. Orexigenic neurons respond to peripheral metabolic signals such as ghrelin, leptin and insulin. Anorexigenic neurons have opposite effect. They suppress appetite and reduce food intake. These neurons mainly release pro-opiomelanocortin. It is precursor of alpha MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Alpha MSH suppresses appetite by acting on melanocortin 4 receptors. Another neuropeptide released by these neurons is cocaine and amphetamine regulated transcript, abbreviated as CART. It also decreases appetite and food intake. Anorexigenic neurons are sensitive to leptin, insulin, CCK and glucagon-like peptide 1. Okay, now let's study peripheral signals affecting hypothalamic neurons associated with feeding behavior. The first and the most important hormone is leptin. Leptin is a satiety hormone, mainly released from adipocytes. It signals body's energy status to the brain and acts as long-term regulator of food intake and energy expenditure. Increase in size or number of adipocytes increases leptin secretion. It acts on orexigenic neurons to inhibit secretion of neuropeptide Y. At the same time, leptin stimulates anorexigenic neurons to release pro-opiomelanocortin. Thus, leptin indicates presence of sufficient energy storage in the body and hence inhibits further food intake. This theory of regulation of food intake based on energy store is known as lipostatic hypothesis. Apart from leptin, other hormones like estrogen, dopamine and peptide YY also decrease food intake. Various gastrointestinal hormones like CCK, that is cholecystokinin, GRP, gastrin-releasing peptide, somatostatin and glucagon also inhibit food intake by inhibiting feeding center. This regulation of food intake by gastrointestinal hormones is called as gut peptide hypothesis. Now let's study peripheral signals which increase food intake. The most important hormone is ghrelin. It is often referred as hunger hormone because its secretion increases before meals and decreases after eating. Ghrelin is released from stomach during fasting or caloric restriction. It stimulates release of neuropeptide Y and hence the food intake. Thus, ghrelin signals hunger and stimulates appetite. Other hormones which increase food intake are melanin concentrating hormone and orexin. Now coming to the next important function of hypothalamus, regulation of water intake, or you can say it as regulation of body fluid volume and osmolarity. Lateral hypothalamus not only serves as feeding center but also the thirst center. It mediates body's response to dehydration. Hypothalamus also has osmoreceptors which are located within the supraoptic nucleus or in OVLT, that means organum vasculosum of lamina terminalis, or they may be in subfornical organ. Both these structures are located outside the blood-brain barrier, which enable them to detect changes in the body fluid osmolarity. Increase in osmolarity of extracellular fluid stimulates thirst center. This gives sensation of thirst and person drinks water. This helps to correct the body fluid volume as well as osmolarity. Any lesion in thirst center leads to dehydration in spite of availability of water and it may be fatal. Increased osmolarity of ECF also stimulates osmoreceptors which in turn stimulate supraoptic nucleus to release ADH. ADH in turn acts on renal tubules and increase water reabsorption, thereby correcting the volume as well as osmolarity of extracellular fluid. Supraoptic nucleus also sends signals to thirst center and initiate drinking of water. Thus, both these mechanisms help to correct osmolarity of the body fluids. In case of dehydration or hypotension without affecting osmolarity, renin is also released from JG cells, leading to formation of angiotensin II. Apart from its other peripheral actions, angiotensin II also stimulates subfornical organ, thus stimulates thirst center and also releases ADH, which helps to correct ECF volume and blood pressure. Now coming to the role of hypothalamus in temperature regulation, preoptic nucleus or anterior hypothalamus acts as temperature sensors. It has about 2/3 heat-sensitive neurons and 1/3 cold-sensitive neurons. Preoptic nucleus also serves as thermostat. Under normal circumstances, its set point is 37.1 degrees Celsius, which can be altered by peripheral thermoreceptors. Set point is the critical body temperature above which heat loss mechanisms are activated and below which heat gain mechanisms are activated, so that body temperature can be maintained at 37.1 degrees Celsius. In simple terms, it's like setting the temperature of AC in the room, which then tries to maintain that particular temperature. Preoptic nucleus mainly responds to rise in temperature and initiates various heat loss mechanisms like sympathetic inhibition, cutaneous vasodilatation, and sweating. In contrast, posterior hypothalamus receives signals from peripheral thermoreceptors as well as from the preoptic nucleus. It acts as integrating center and initiates mainly the heat gain mechanisms like sympathetic stimulation, shivering, and chemical thermogenesis. Dorsomedial nucleus of hypothalamus acts as shivering center. Peripheral thermoreceptors are present in skin and viscera and mainly detect changes in cell temperature and accordingly alter the hypothalamic set point. They primarily prevent hypothermia. Let's use the analogy of car to remember hypothalamic nuclei responsible for temperature regulation. The radiator is typically placed at the front end of the car's bonnet, which dissipates heat generated by the engine located behind it. With this image in mind, it becomes clear that anterior hypothalamus triggers the mechanism for heat loss, while the posterior hypothalamus initiates mechanisms for heat gain. Next is the role of hypothalamus in regulation of sleep and wakefulness cycle. Stimulation of anterior hypothalamus induces sleep and thus it acts as sleep facilitatory center. In contrast, stimulation of posterior hypothalamus causes waking and hence considered as waking center. Therefore, lesion in posterior hypothalamus leads to coma. Next function of hypothalamus is regulation of sexual behavior and reproductive functions. Exposure of fetal hypothalamus to testosterone causes continuous secretion of GnRH in males at the time of puberty and thereafter. As the female fetus is not exposed to testosterone, hypothalamus releases GnRH in cyclical manner from puberty onwards. This is also responsible for a typical male or female type of behavior. Connections between preoptic and tuberal region are necessary for LH surge in females, which leads to ovulation. Arcuate nucleus and other hypothalamic nuclei switch to secrete prolactin-releasing hormone during lactation. Apart from this, hypothalamus is an important component of limbic system. It brings about physical expression of emotions like changes in heart rate, blood pressure, dryness of mouth, flushing, etc. Mammillary body is important part of Papez circuit and hence is concerned with emotions as well as memory. Hypothalamus is also concerned with affective aspects of sensations due to presence of reward and punishment centers in it. Lateral and ventromedial nucleus acts as reward center. Their stimulation give pleasant feeling and motivate the person to perform the act again and again. Strong stimulation of reward center leads to tameness and calmness. In contrast, periventricular nuclei act as punishment center. Their stimulation gives sensation of fear and pain. An animal or person avoids the acts that stimulate punishment centers. These centers also play important role in learning and memory related to information, acts and things. Intense activation of punishment center frequently triggers a surge of violent and aggressive behavior known as rage. This state is marked by defensive posture, claw extension, tail elevation, pilorection, hissing, spitting, and wide open eyes with dilated pupils. Even mild provocation can prompt severe attacks from the animal. Normally, rage is suppressed by connections between hypothalamus and cortex, but damage to these connections, as in decorticate animal, exhibits outburst of rage and it is called as sham rage, as this rage is not associated with emotions. Sham rage can be abolished by lesion in caudal hypothalamus. Now coming to the last function of hypothalamus, its role in circadian rhythm. Circadian rhythms refer to cyclical changes that occur in period of 24 hours in the body. For example, sleep-wakefulness cycle, changes in the hormonal secretions, etc. Suprachiasmatic nucleus acts as biological clock and regulates circadian rhythms as per the light and dark cycle. It receives inputs from photosensitive ganglion cells of the retina via retinohypothalamic tract as well as from the lateral geniculate body. Suprachiasmatic nucleus in turn regulates release of various neurotransmitters, hormones and other biological processes, and all work together to ensure optimal synchronization of internal rhythms with the external environment. A travel by high-speed jet across the time zones leads to discrepancies between biological clock and the environmental signals and causes a phenomenon called as jet lag. Its symptoms include irritability, inability to sleep or wake up early, mood changes, and gastrointestinal upsets. But the symptoms of jet lag diminish in few days as the biological clock resets to the new environmental conditions. So as we wrap up our discussion, let's summarize the key functions of various hypothalamic nuclei. The preoptic and anterior nuclei primarily regulates parasympathetic activity and facilitate heat loss. The anterior nucleus additionally involved in sleep induction. Conversely, the posterior hypothalamus governs sympathetic activity, initiate heat gain mechanisms, and serve as waking center. Suprachiasmatic nucleus controls circadian rhythm. Supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei regulate secretion of posterior pituitary. Supraoptic nucleus also regulates body fluid volume and osmolarity due to release of ADH and its osmoreceptor function. Tuberal region, including arcuate nucleus, controls anterior pituitary secretions and reproductive functions. Dorsomedial nucleus serves as shivering center. Ventromedial nucleus acts as satiety center and reward center, while lateral nucleus is hunger and thirst center, as well as reward center and regulates sympathetic activity. And the last, mammillary body is concerned with memory and emotions. So that's all for this session, and thank you for joining in. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe it and press the bell icon to stay updated about the latest contents. Do share the video with your friends and colleagues and give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and I'll catch you in the next video. Once again, thank you for watching.